I would now like to introduce our next panel to the stage, and it promises to challenge all of us. It promises to be thought-provoking and outline just how national and subnational governments are contributing to weaning the world off the thirst for fossil fuels. Please put your hands together and join me in welcoming a few of our guests. Tzeporah Berman, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London and co-chair of C40 Cities. And last but certainly not least, our moderator, Governor Bill Ritter, Jr., president and chair of the North American Board for Climate Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Before you depart, we appreciate your work and the introduction. So we're going to have a discussion. The two panelists and I are going to talk about something that I think is on the mind of a lot of people as we think about energy transition, and that's the refrain that we hear that you can't really end the use of fossil fuels anytime soon, maybe even ever, and especially you can't do it if you care about things like justice and equity and the economy. So there's a lot of people, I think, that may put up what I consider to be some false choices about our exit from fossil fuels over time because they make economic arguments that certainly appeal to a lot of people and appeal to their pocketbooks. And they make equity arguments that certainly also appeal to a lot of people, both those in the environmental justice movement, the justice movements generally, but also to people in public life. And so first question is going to go to a man who's absolutely in public life as the mayor of London. And I'll put it to you this way. Let's talk first about the role of cities, especially those in the C40 network, in influencing global policies that drive the transition away from fossil fuels. What is that role? And how can cities collaborate to create a united front on climate action?
Well, Bill, it's a pleasure to be here. Good to see so many people here this afternoon. Look, I'm a big fan of the current Secretary General of the United Nations. He said something really interesting recently, Antonio Guterres. He said, cities are the first responders to the climate emergency. And the reason why he said this, Bill, is the evidence over the last few years, the last few decades, is countries have been delaying taking action when it comes to the issues you've talked about, whereas cities have been taking action. We are the doers versus the delayers. In addition to being the mayor of London, apologies to my friends from New York, the greatest city in the world, I'm also co-chair of C40, which used to be 40 cities, now 96 cities across the globe. And we've got targets which we're on course to meeting to reduce our emissions by at least half by 2030. 3/4 of those cities who are members of C40, 3/4, 66, are doing much better than our respective governments. I'll give you some tangible examples of what we're doing. So I had a chat with the previous mayor of New York, and I said, listen, both of us invest huge amounts of money through our pensions indirectly in fossil fuels. Why do we divest from fossil fuels? And there's now 20 cities divesting our funds from fossil fuels. $500 billion is now no longer going to fossil fuels, is instead going to cleaner, sustainable energies. That's the power of cities.
So that's kind of the stick approach. I'm going to ask Tzeporah a question about the carrots. As the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, you advocate for the rapid reduction of fossil fuel production. What incentives do you believe are most effective in encouraging fossil fuel economies to diversify their economies and invest in renewables, particularly given the uneven stages of development and economic reliance on fossil fuels?
That was a mouthful.
That was a mouthful.
It's great to be here. Look, I think one thing that we have to remember is that this moment in history, leadership matters. And these are tough issues. But that's why we've been working with thousands of organizations around the world, now in 117 countries that have endorsed the concept of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. and 13 countries that have now formed a block of nations that are starting to grow the idea of this fossil fuel treaty. Countries like Colombia. Colombia is the 6th largest exporter of coal in the world. And I found President Petro really inspiring on the stage in Dubai when he joined the fossil fuel treaty, and he said, look, every day we're making the problem worse, and we know it. And we can't do this on our own. We need greater international cooperation. So that's one of the critical pieces. So we need leadership, we need international cooperation. The idea of a fossil fuel treaty is that it would be a companion to the Paris Agreement to help us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Because for decades, we've been negotiating about emissions and targets, and meanwhile, we keep growing the production of fossil fuels. So right now, we're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 2 degrees. So, and we know the International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're all really clear. If we want to meet our Paris goals, that means no new projects. It means no new investment. But that's not what we're seeing right now around the world. So how do we help countries cooperate, and how do those countries create new rules, new global governance in order to remove the barriers so that they're not continually expanding fossil fuels? So a couple of things. Right now, we know the Amazon is on fire, yet many countries are drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon just to service their debt. So what we need is, we have to stop tinkering around the edges right now. We have to look at serious restructuring, and I think that's tough to hear. So what does financial restructuring mean? What are the incentives? That means debt cancellation to keep carbon in the ground. It means to create more fiscal space. Last year, countries in the global south spent $843 billion just servicing their debt. And now they're struggling with climate damages, with the floods, with the fires, the extreme weather that we just heard is estimated to cost $16 million an hour, every hour in aggregate over the past 20 years. So this is about supporting them to create together new economic structures. We can't rely on the ways of the past. And right now, a lot of the international bodies, look at the IMF, we're still relying on the ways of the past. This year, new agreements that the IMF asked countries to sign to get their loans, they had to commit to increase fossil fuel production. So we need to align that. We need wealth and fossil fuel damage levies to create alternative revenues. These companies are getting away with highway robbery. They're the most profitable companies on earth, and they have made $2.8 billion every year, every day, for the past 50 years, according to the IMF, according to the World Bank data. So we need to figure out how to move some of that wealth to get countries the support they need in order to do economic diversification. And it's not just about growing renewables. It's great what happened in Dubai last year, commitment to tripling renewables. But the atmosphere doesn't care how many solar panels we build. The atmosphere cares how many fossil fuel projects we don't build. So what that means is when we make commitments to increasing renewables, they have to be joined with displacing fossil fuel assets. That's the bottom line. We have to stop building fossil fuel projects, stop investing in fossil fuel projects. And CCS and BECS and all of this modeling that we're seeing and that we've been talking about now for 30 years, let's face it, it's not working. Those solutions are not working fast enough. We may need some of them, but we can't use them as a justification to increase production. So if we're going to support countries in actually creating a plan to phase out fossil fuels, we need a companion agreement to the Paris Agreement, because right now, countries aren't talking about who gets to produce and how much. We're leaving it up to the markets. The markets aren't going to make sure that we stay within a global carbon budget, and they're certainly not going to ensure that we have justice and equity as we ensure a phase out of fossil fuels.
Somebody once said to me, markets do a lot, but they don't control timing. Markets do not control timing, and we're on a bit of a ticking clock here that we have to worry about.
I'm not sure that's right.
What's that?
That's not right. I think they can control timing because they can control governments. You see, the incentive, to answer your question, to people in positions of power and influence is if you don't do it, you'll be voted out. The incentive is the first mover advantage. There are jobs to be created in building the solar panels, in building the wind turbines, in driving the electric buses, in installing the electric vehicle charging points, in the green economy. That's the incentive. Who sensibly would invest in those businesses, those sectors, park your moral case in fossil fuels? That is the business of the past. Anybody sensible, if a Martian landed, they would be foolish to invest in coal, gas, or oil. If they were smart, they'd invest in wind, in solar, and so forth, the energies of the next 300 years. So I think, markets can also be influenced in relation to people power, shareholders, and so forth. And look, in London, I stood on a platform in May where climate was on the ballot paper. It was a culture war. And we had the argument, and you know what? We won.
Yeah, so having been a governor, I said that we were going to invest in a clean energy economy, and in 2030 we'll have no more coal in a state that had over 65% coal in the portfolio when I became governor in 2007. So that's 17 years. So I think we've had a similar experience, and a lot of that was driven not just by regulation, but also by economic circumstances and by a market. When we talk about fossil fuels, we group coal, oil, and gas together. Do you see some differences when you think about coal versus oil or gas in terms of their place in the future and our own reliance upon them as we go forward and try and transition to a clean economy? I'll throw it to you first.
Sure, of course there are differences in terms of how are we going to approach the replacement of those three fossil fuels. But I think what we've heard over the last couple of years from the oil and gas sector is a lot of obfuscation about those differences. Yes, coal, but gas is okay. Gas is, a bridge. Gas might have been a bridge 10, 15, 20 years ago. Right now, gas is a blockade to a renewable future. It's displacing renewables. We now have evidence to show that the emissions, especially methane emissions, are underreported significantly. We can't keep building infrastructure, whether it's gas or oil or coal, at this moment in history, because every ton of carbon matters, and what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. I'm just kind of horrified by what we're seeing right now in the markets. Saudi Aramco just did a loan, got their loans confirmed, and I was so horrified. It was a bond insurance, and it was $6 billion in bond insurance. $6 billion in bond insurance. It was referred to as a global medium-term note, maturing in 2064. If we're using that much oil in 2064, then that means we're on the trajectory we're currently on. And let's not forget that that trajectory means that huge areas of the planet will no longer be habitable for humans because we're going to see such lethal humidity. So we actually need to be planning for a survivable planet, and that actually means that we need to stop expansion now of all of those three fossil fuels. The solutions to how we replace them are going to be different. And often when I make this argument to the oil CEOs, I hear, but that's ridiculous. We can't replace oil and gas right now with current technologies. Okay, maybe there's still a lot of work to do, for example, in aviation. That's 2% of global emissions. So if you look at what the IEA has put out this year, we could, with existing technologies today, by 2035, reduce oil and gas use in our economies by 50%. And that's not what we're doing. We're increasing it. So we need renewable energy, we need electrification, we need to stop investing in fossil fuels, and we need to stop pretending that some of it is okay. Because right now, everybody, every country, every company wants to be the last barrel sold. So there's no limits. And there has to be limits on production and not just emissions.
I mean, my view, Bill, is I think we should be respectful to the global south, the global majority,
Absolutely.
who are suffering the worst consequences of a situation they didn't cause. And I think those of us in the global north should provide leadership. So what I'd say is, for those of us in the global north, the wealthier countries, those responsible for the catastrophe we face, we've got to make that transition as soon as possible. So, for example, I'm really pleased and proud that in July this year, the British public voted for a new government, and that new Labour government has announced no new oil or gas licenses on the North Sea. They've also set a quite strict target by 2030, double the amount of onshore energy produced, triple the amount of solar energy produced, quadruple the amount of offshore energy produced. I think for those in the global south, I think we've got to be a bit respectful lecturing them that you can't do oil, you can't do gas, you can't do coal straight away like us in the global north, because they're not responsible for where we are now, and they will need more time and more of a runway to make that transition.
So I'm going to be an apologist for the United States just for a minute, because I totally agree with you. I think that's exactly right. And I also think first world countries, developed countries, need to lead by example. And we have the best climate administration we've ever had.
I agree.
With the Biden administration.
Agree.
But at the state level, California passed a rule saying no more vehicles sold that are internal combustion engines in 2035. Now over 10 states have followed that lead. Another number, I think it's up to 20 some, have low emitting vehicle standards. And so like addressing vehicles is going to be one of the most important ways for us to think about, on the demand side, how to cut down oil and gas. And so at the state level, even with all that the federal government's doing, we're seeing a number of things happening at the state level and at the city level that are going to make real differences over time in what demand looks like in the automobile industry. I agree with you about aviation. Can you tell me, Tzeporah, what is shipping? Is it like 3% of global emissions?
I think it's a little more.
It's something like that, over 3. So the two together, they call them harder to carbonize.
They're a bit easier in shipping, and we're already seeing some of them come into play.
Yeah. So is that a 15-year thing that can happen in shipping, where we can decarbonize fleets?
Yeah, significantly. And also, let's remember, as we start reducing and phasing out fossil fuels, the problem actually becomes a lot easier, because fossil fuels are so inefficient. 40% of shipping today globally is just to move fossil fuels around. So can we decrease emissions from fossil fuels quite significantly if we phase out fossil fuels? Absolutely. And then there's the technological fixes. But I want to address this question in the Global South, because I'm working with a number of Global South governments right now who are working on the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and others who are looking at joining the call for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And I think we're designing this piece of work with equity and justice in mind. So what does that mean when it comes to production? And we hear the fossil fuel industry saying a lot, well, global energy poverty, there's 600 million people in Africa, we need to turn the lights on. Look, the fossil fuel industry has had decades, in fact, about 100 years to turn the lights on in Africa. And they've done a lot of fossil fuel development, and they haven't. Look at Nigeria. Huge oil development. 60% of the country still doesn't have energy, because what we're seeing right now in the Global South by the fossil fuel industry is a colonial model. It's a continuation of the colonial model. We're treating Africa and increasingly Southeast Asia as the global North's gas station. And the impacts of that fossil fuel development are being seen in the Global South, and the benefits are leaving the Global South to the Global North. So if we want to support those countries in energy access, then we should be supporting those countries to help build a cleaner, safer world, and not making the mistakes that we've made that have caused these problems. And again, the fossil fuel industry will say, but we need more development in the global south. But where are they actually developing? 825 new oil and gas leases handed out in 2023. Where are they? 5 countries: Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, and Norway. The largest number of new permits in oil and gas in 1 year ever given out in the history since records began. 67% of all new oil and gas licenses since 2020 have been in those 5 global north countries. 51% of the expansion of fossil fuels planned today between now and 2050 in those 5 countries. So the fossil fuel is using this conversation about energy access in order to mask, I think, what they're actually doing. And what they're actually doing is the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. They're trying to get in as much infrastructure and new projects as they can right now because they see the writing on the wall. And that's not going to support justice or equity in the global south.
Okay, so I hear that. I do think that it's a transition and that it's important to understand in the transition how you assure that people are sort of brought along. So I'm just going to go back to the incentive part of the question. I'm not disagreeing with you. I just want to go back to the mayor for the incentive part of the question. And Tzeporah, I want to talk to you about fossil fuel subsidies because we haven't really talked about that. I want to know what part of the treaty they are. But Mayor, what are the subsidies inside of a regulatory scheme or financial scheme that can really make a difference in ensuring that it's an equitable transition or that we make the transition at all?
Yes, a really important question, and that's at the crux of this discussion about the transition. How do we use the word carrot or stick? How do we incentivize this movement so the cities around the globe have a number of different ways of incentivizing that transition? We've got to take people with us. Sometimes it's fellowship, sometimes it's leadership. There's a great Henry Ford saying, people just want faster horses, right? But without being arrogant, you've got to realize you've got to provide leadership. That means educating citizens of your city or country about the consequences of inaction versus the costs of action. So, for example, an incentive is if you want permission to build any building in London, any building, it's got to be zero carbon during the construction from the whole cycle. If it's not zero carbon, you are not building in London. That's an incentive. So what that's led to is all our buildings since I've been mayor, when they're built, are zero carbon. I'll give you another incentive. If you're going to drive in London, an incentive, if you want to drive in London, is your vehicle must be a clean vehicle. If it's not, you've got to pay £12.50. That's meant in 8 years, we've managed to reduce the nitrogen dioxide in the central London, central London by 54%, in inner London by 21%, in outer London by 20%. When I first became mayor, they told me it would take 193 years to make the air in London lawful. We'll do it by next year. That's the incentive to make that transition. I'll give you another example of incentive. We have said to bus companies who want to operate in London, you can operate in London, but from now on, every bus that you use in London must be zero emission, electric or hydrogen. We have the largest number of electric buses in the Western world now. An incentive if you're going to be a taxi driver in London is it's got to be electric. More than half our black taxis are now electric. And we're giving incentives. We're giving funds, £500 million, to those businesses who want to set up businesses that are energy efficient in London. Our green economy in London is now worth 50 billion. By 2030, it'll be worth 100 billion. We are the green finance capital of the world. So there are incentives there in relation to, if you want to be a bus driver in Bogota, you'll be driving an electric bus in Bogota. In Freetown, if you want to start a business, you've got to invest in planting trees as well. So there are things you can do to incentivize action, a combination of carrot and stick. But the biggest incentive is for citizens is actually the future jobs are in the green economy. We'll help train you up. We're giving free training to people to be trained in the green economy. That's an incentive to scale up better paid high school jobs.
And I know it's the best city in the world, but it's just one city. I mean, imagine the collaboration among all the cities in the world that have the ability to do that, and at the whatever the subnational level, whether it's a state or a city, if we all sort of work together and have that kind of a viewpoint, then it is.
You'll know, but when you're a governor, I mean, governors and mayors can be far more nimble, dexterous. You can move fast, and we're close to our people, aren't we?
You care a great deal about jobs.
Spot on.
Care a great deal about work, and not allowing people to make this argument that's really a false dichotomy against a future, that is fossil fuel free and a future that has economic viability. So we talked about subsidies. We haven't mentioned them so far, but they seem to play a role in maintaining fossil fuel economies. And it would seem to me if there's ever a treaty, it would have to deal with how particularly developed countries have offered subsidies to fossil fuels for a very long time.
Well, I don't think it's just developed countries. Even in the wealthy countries, there's been a commitment to reduce fossil fuel subsidies now for many years, and they're going up. The IMF reports last year that we're at $7 trillion a year. That's $13 million in fossil fuel subsidies a minute. And we need to focus on supporting people and not polluting companies and fossil fuels. So billions and billions of that money is going to the producers, to the big oil and gas companies here in the US and in Canada and other wealthy countries. Billions are going to those companies for carbon capture and storage, which we know is underperforming by about 80% and not working. And look, subsidizing planting trees, carbon capture and storage, while expanding drilling, it's like drinking carrot juice in the morning and then smoking a pack a day and saying, they cancel each other out. They don't cancel each other out. So we need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. If we do that, we can free up money for the reforms that support people. We need to boost social protection systems. We need to make direct cash transfers to vulnerable groups, or make grants or offer incentives to consumers, like for heat pumps, for electric vehicles, for renewable energy. The majority of fossil fuel subsidies are not helping us support people. They're helping us continue to support fossil fuel incumbents and getting us stuck in a system that's literally killing us.
So I'm sorry we're out of time, but we are out of time. And I thank you both for everything that you contributed to this discussion. Let's give them a round of applause, folks. Thank you. Thank you.